Thank you, panel, for coming here today. Thank you, Kwong and Plato, for sponsoring this event. This is my multiple ones I've been here, and it's awesome to be a guest here tonight. And for moderating. So, just an anecdote, for those who don't know, I actually do a leadership podcast, and someone today in the audience said, "Hey, I listened to your podcast," and that made me feel like Tim Ferriss for a second. I was super excited about that. I want to start off with a quote. It's a story that Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, asked Peter Thiel, his main investor, what's the single most important piece of advice that you could give us? And he thought for a moment and said, don't fuck up the culture, right? And I think that's a little bit of why we're here today, to talk about how important culture really is, right? Another person you may have heard of, Dan Pink, has authored several books on changing workplaces. Says people are generally happier and more productive. The mic's going in and out, right? When they have autonomy, mastery, and purpose in their work. And some of the most successful high-tech companies have made sure that they've put that into their culture. And culture means different things to different people. So I want to ask the different panelists today. I'll start with Sudhi right next to me. Okay. What does culture mean to you, personally?
For me, culture is all about values and also the personality of people, because I feel it should be easy enough for people to live the culture day in and day out. For me, culture, for me and Zeus, the company I work at, culture is about bringing your dog to work. For example, one of the values we have is speak up. So it is, if engineers want to have their own tech initiatives that they want to help out for the company, they can speak up and we'll fund it and they can go and work on it. It's about conducting hackathons, having fun. We also have another value called don't stop caring. So we do engage every quarter in giving back to the community. For me, culture is all about being and loving the people that you work with, and also being part of the vision of the company. And then lastly, sort of giving a fist bump to the security guard every day.
Hi, I'm Seth, formerly VP of Engineering at TuneIn. I left because of culture. I can tell you over drinks later about that. So I think what I've noticed is with engineers especially, if you ask what the culture is, when people say they had a great culture or a not great culture, without the engineering word, they're talking mostly about the values of the people they work around, and do they like each other? Do they enjoy having lunch? Do they enjoy having a dog in the office? And that kind of goes to kind of the basic level of need, which is, do I enjoy coming to work and seeing the faces of all these people and feel like they like me? When you add the word engineering, I found that usually speaks to a sense of pride, that there are actions and behaviors that happen in the engineering workplace that make you say, that could have gone poorly or that went well, and I'm really proud of that. Either the code review could have gone poorly, but they helped me. But the feedback was awesome. That was great level. Or we have this high standard for technical achievement, or for standards for quality, for craftsmanship. So it goes into both the feelings of and the compatibility with the people, but mostly the sense of pride. And that's when I talk to engineering leaders specifically, I really look at the base level is kind of company-wide, and certainly as an engineering leader, you can affect that because you hire and nurture a lot of the company. But the other part is really making sure that there's a reason why people come to work for you and for that company, because as most engineers can do what they do for pretty much every company or most companies. There's a specific reason why, and it's usually because there's a sense of pride. There's an attachment to why you do it for this company.
Cool. My name's Tito. I work at Segment. I think for me, definitely culture boils down to a set of values, and then I think the values, this is a little trite, but I think the values are sort of a framework for making decisions when the leadership team or the co-founders or whoever aren't in the room. I think the values are sort of what you come back to help you make those decisions. At Segment, we have 4 values: karma, drive, tribe, and focus. I set off this year to figure out what our engineering culture was at the beginning of the year, and thought for some reason it was going to be different than the company values. And then after about a month of failing at that, decided it was definitely the same as the company values. I think the interpretation for engineering can be a little bit different. Well, what does the value karma, for instance, mean to the engineering team? For the marketing team, it means like don't do crappy content and put it out there and just blast channels. I think for the engineering team, karma is a deep sense of kind of focusing on the customer and what the customer needs. So it's a little bit different, but I think it gets back to the same kind of core value. And that's what it is for Segment. Uma.
Hi, this is Uma. I used to be at Delphix until 2 weeks ago, and I'm joining a new company in another week. So I'm going to talk in the context of Delphix. I've actually been very lucky that every company that I've worked for has had like a really great culture, and I've kind of self-selected almost like on a subconscious level. And now, as I've like actually learned what good and bad cultures look like, I've kind of tried to be more careful. And I think I'm going to a place with a great culture very soon. So to me, the culture is kind of there's these unspoken rules and there's these kind of intangibles that kind of govern like everything from like the first time a recruiter cold calls you or like, reaches out on LinkedIn, like the phrasing they use in their email to you from your exit interview when you leave a company. And that's like every step of the way, like what are the things that people do and what are the rules that they follow through that. And their interactions is kind of like the company culture. I think the things are both places that I've worked at previously, the things that I really valued were like extremely high trust environments. And I think that without trust, like fundamental to me is having an extremely trustworthy environment where you trust your coworkers, you trust your boss, you trust your reports, you trust everyone like around you to do the right thing. And that is fundamental. So I was actually very fortunate to see kind of like company core values being formed at my last company, because we had a CEO change and the new CEO was like, we don't actually have core values. And he actually wanted us to come up with a set of core values. What I liked is he didn't do it in a top-down way. And there wasn't like all hands very like put them up on a presentation. He actually went like across the company and came up with a set of core values. And to my surprise and delight, the top one was fostering trust. So I think that is what culture means to me. And I'm very conscious in like evaluating company culture, like in all my job searches. So I actually had a spreadsheet for my job search and one column was explicitly culture.
Great. Now, if you could tell me, going in reverse this way, in as few words as possible, at your current or most previous company, what was that company's culture, right?
So at Delphix, the company culture was, as I said, trust. Fostering trust was the top culture. It was very collaborative. And I think this was seen in every interaction. So like from like the minute I stepped in the door to like the day I was leaving, everybody was like, how can we help you? How can we make things better?
So trust and was it one of the big
collaboration,
right? Trust and collaboration. Right.
And then I think kind of obvious, it almost like is kind of like an overused word at this point, which is innovation and excellence.
Sure.
But I think that they really embodied those values.
Tito, what about you?
Cool. So as I said, karma, tribe, drive, and focus are our 4 values. I think karma is definitely the one that we spend the most time talking about with candidates and the one that feels the most unique. It's this sense that we, like every interaction we have with like a partner, with a customer, with like a candidate that we reject, whatever it is, we want to sort of leave them with an awesome experience and hopefully leave them with some value. And I get on the phone pretty often with engineering candidates that we reject and give them very detailed feedback on like what our impression was. And even though this is not going to be, it's not going to work out for them to work at Segment, we want to be like a really high karma situation. We want to treat other folks like we would like to be treated. And those calls are not the most fun things in the world, but I think that's what karma is really about. And I think that's the one value that sets Segment apart the most.
Sure. Seth?
Christian said as few words as possible, which is shut the hell up.
Which is telling, right? I think having to be able to succinctly get your culture into one sentence is tough.
So I was brought into TuneIn to turn the team around. It felt very much stuck in a decade ago. So when I spoke to Pride, that was really the key, which is he looked at every indicator in terms of the programming languages, the tools, the standards for good craftsmanship for code. Those are all, you could say, in every way, shape, or form, we're not in line with sort of the best practices of today. So in a succinct way, a lot of it was upgrading. It was very much keeping to what, as an engineer, you would feel proud to work with on for. Talked about a lot of other values in terms of the kind of people you want to work with, the mission of the company, but a lot of it is just kind of up-leveling the expectations of the team.
Sure. Sue.
In the previous company I worked at too, and in the current company, when we talk about culture, the most important thing is trust and commitment. Some of the values that we have are around this. We have say no to status quo. If there's fun to be had, have it. Don't stop caring. Speak up. All of these. So for me, those are the most important things when I think about culture.
I'll stick with you for a second. One's not working. I'll stick with you for a second too. So obviously, different cultures. You worked at Blackhawk,
Right.
and how is that culture from a financial services company much different from your most recent company?
That's a good question. So I joined Blackhawk before the IPO, and then we went IPO. So I saw the culture shifting drastically. Before the IPO, it was more collaboration. There was a lot of trust and less processes because people trusted people to just do the work. But after we went IPO, the culture shifted because we also grew rapidly, so we needed to establish some processes. These were not bad, but it was necessary. But at Zoosk, we are smaller, so I see a huge shift from what it was at Blackhawk.
Sure. And Tito, for you, worked at 3 sort of interesting companies in your past: Facebook, Dropbox, and Segment. Right? How would you sort of define and compare and contrast some of the cultural differences between the 3?
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I didn't understand Facebook's culture deeply until I was like maybe 6 months in at Dropbox, and I was like, oh man, by the differences of these 2 places, I deeply understand it. Facebook was very famous, of course, for the move fast and break things mentality. I think they changed it to a much lamer value, move fast on stable infra or something incredibly lame like that years after.
Speak, right?
But yeah, I think it was interesting. Yeah. There we go. Sorry if I'm insulting anyone. I think it's a little lamer than move
So
fast.
was that in the little red book, that secret little red book they have of culture?
I think that was probably after my time. I never saw the secret red book. But anyway, yeah. And then Dropbox was very different. Dropbox had a bunch of different values, but I think like sweat the details was always the value that came up over and over and over again. And I think that was really core to the Dropbox kind of way of doing things, and it was just very starkly different and really interesting. And then Segments really around sort of this karma and customer value, and really focusing on the customer, focusing on our partners. But I think it was just interesting that you don't even really fully appreciate your culture until you're at a different place, and you're like, wow, this is really different. Facebook was my first job out of school, so definitely big deltas between all 3.
Yeah, and you've also mentioned that cultural can change over time, right? For better or worse, and it tends to be that culture changes as you grow. Right? We just heard Nick speak about how do you maintain sort of culture in a fast-growing environment, right? And then you mentioned the topic of how it changed pre-IPO and post-IPO. Do you feel it changed for the better, worse, or just different?
It was just different. So one example is, before we could ship code very fast, quick turnaround time. But after IPO, we had to be careful. Shareholders were always watching us, so we had to be more careful with releases. It got slower. And the financial industry cares a lot about, we're dealing with people's money in real time, and if someone is going to buy a gift card, you don't want anything happening to that experience. So there's a lot at stake there. As opposed to now at Zoosk, it's all about dating. We have the same kind of scaling problems and stuff, but the values, we are much more relaxed.
Yeah, I would maybe just add, I think it's definitely that as the needs of the business change, that's sort of, you have to evolve the culture to meet the needs of the business. And, in the early days at Facebook, the most important thing was to tip countries, and it didn't matter if the site only worked 6 out of 7 days, as long as you got the network in there. And that's what our whole company was focused on from 2008 to 2010. And then as like making money and being reliable became a lot more important, the culture really had to shift to support that, I think.
Sure. And I think the one thing I want to try to transition the conversation to a little bit too is around people, right? Because so much of culture depends upon people. And people, right, hiring, right? And employee retention is aspects, all aspects have a business and structured, but it starts with who you allow in, right? Who you're going to allow to come in to join this unique culture that you've created, because every single person that you bring in will affect that culture in a certain way, right? So I'm going to move a little bit to, hiring. You mentioned before about in your culture, how do you feel that people coming in to your organization know what your cultural is when they're starting the interview process? Like, do you make it very clear about what the values are when they're interviewing in the process? Right, Seth?
Absolutely. I think of hiring as an extension of what you do with your current team every day. You try to hire them or keep them interested, keep them motivated, keep them retained. So you're effectively recruiting them. And if you have the pulse on why they love coming to work, that's a message to sell. Most of it is culture. I mean, a lot of it is the standards. I mentioned that about that you feel proud about as an engineering organization. A lot of it is what the team here is really nicely illustrated about the values of the people and how much you love seeing them and they love seeing you and all that. That, whether you like it or not, comes across in any sort of interview. So you may as well be explicit about it. So absolutely.
Yeah, so I've actually just done this, and I was actually telling Jeff about it. So you have to remember that people are like interviewing you as much as you're interviewing them in the process. So as an engineering manager, it was like really interesting to me to see how interview processes for engineering managers varied so dramatically. They're completely different. Like the engineering interviews are very structured. There's kind of like a well-known formula, like, design, coding, kind of culture fit, / kind of, like HR kind of thing. But it's like a very well-known process. Engineering manager, like I went through this process and it's very dramatically different depending on which company you're interviewing for. And finally, the company that I actually chose to go to had one of the best processes. So you have to be very mindful of the process because you're essentially kind of showcasing your culture in the interview process. Because whether or not you're like, what you structure, like who you get the candidate to talk to in the process is like, reflecting the process to them. And you have to be careful about the kind of signals you're sending. Another point to add is you also want culture to be an explicit check in this process because especially if you're hiring senior people or engineering managers, those people are in turn going to hire other people. So if you're not evaluating for culture at that point, then you're essentially going to lose your culture through the hiring process.
So I think another quote is that they've done studies that employee retention is pretty directly correlated to how much that employee fits into a company's culture, right? If you're going to work at Patagonia, right, versus Amazon or Netflix, which has its own, I think everyone here probably understands what Netflix's culture is, that's different. And making sure that you are a fit on the employee and the hiring process is just as important, right? So for everyone in the audience here, how many of do you guys have a culture book or culture deck like HubSpot or Netflix or anything that you guys, it's codified in writing somewhere, right? So how many of you could also, I think some of us even, we talked a lot and we used a lot of descriptive terms. How many of you could, in one sentence, describe your company's culture? You feel like you could do it very accurately, right? Handful of people, right? And I think it's very important. And I think, what Uma talked about, the importance of making sure that you're consistent in that message that you're telling your candidates during the interview process is extremely important, right? To make sure that they're a good match for you as well as you're a good match for them, right? And you touched on it briefly, Uma. What do you do as part of the process? Okay, I'll start with you, Sue, for a second. What do you do as part of the process to make sure they're a match, right?
One of the first things we do is we have a cultural interview as the first round, where we the hiring manager calls the person, and we sort of just go into the details of their work, and we show a lot of interest in what work they take pride in, and how good are they about speaking to their experience. And then we sort of talk about our values, and we ask them questions like, have you read our engineering blog? Sort of to see if they actually show that interest and reciprocate back. And also once they come on site, we make sure that they have cross-functional interviews, and it's not just technical. We do have technical interviews, but cross-functional is equally important, especially we include people from marketing, design, product. They bring in different perspective. They sometimes ask questions like, have you worked with designers and what is your thought process? So we don't ask those questions being in engineering. So that really helps out. But most importantly, one last thing I wanted to touch upon is once they join, we also make sure for people who leave the company for their own personal reasons, we define a culture such that we've been lucky that people actually work with us over 3 months to 6 months to actually form a great transition plan, even find a replacement and then leave. So I think that culture spreads above and beyond and into the whole journey of an employee.
I mean, I think the first step is just making it explicit. What are those things, what are those attributes you're looking for that make up your culture? So I hear this a lot that, we want engineers that have high standards and show initiative. And then the interview is, hey, I'm going to tell you what to do. It's a very bounded problem, sort 2 lists, and basically it's a pass-fail problem. So how are you observing initiative and a sense of high standards? So you'd rather customize a project that allows you to show that, maybe have an open-ended project with open amounts of time so that they can manage your expectations. They can determine the standard that's done. So a lot of it is just kind of being clear up front. Again, I think of it as recruiting your own team first and then people that aren't in your team second. So make it explicit to them. They know what your expectations are, what the joint expectations are. Allows you to then do things like craft an interview process, articulate that much more coherently across the board to anybody who's interviewing you as well.
Yeah, I think so. We had a culture coffee, which was an incredibly unstructured 30 minutes without a lot of guidance up until the beginning of this year. And I think there's actually a pretty big danger of relying on signal that's incredibly unstructured. There's lots of studies in unconscious bias and other areas that just show that this is going to test for would you like to sit next to this person on a plane for 12 hours, or would you like to grab beers with this person? And it's actually really not a great test of culture. And so one of the big things we did in the last 6 months or so is we developed a core interviewing program. And basically we took all of our values, we mapped them to attributes that we think embody those values, and then we mapped those to very specific questions, questions that test grit, questions that test a bunch of different attributes that map to our values. And we actually have a very clear rubric. We took a bunch of our most calibrated and most senior interviewers, and it's a very special program. Only about 10 or 15 interviewers are qualified to do these, and we use this as some of our most useful signal as a hiring manager is what comes out of this core interview. And I think that's really putting your money where your mouth is. If you have these values you care about, thinking deeply about what attributes you expect and what exact questions you should be asking these people, and spending time with every single candidate. That's the only mandatory question we have across every single job description or every single role we're hiring for. There must be a core interview, and that's for this very purpose.
I mean, so very good. I mean, trying to get quantitative around your hiring process. Again, anyone here, does anyone have core values and them spelled out for the engineering panel on their interviewing rubric? So they're interviewing. How many companies do that right now? Right? So I think it's Tito, that sounds like an awesome process there. I'd love to talk to you more about that as well, because I think we can all learn a little bit about really trying to make that quantitative to get away from that, that bias of hiring the mini-me, right? Uma?
I just wanted to add, I think culture fit is kind of a very loaded term for the reasons that Tito mentioned. A better term I've heard used is culture add. So you really, and I think you really want to be careful that you don't go so far into trying for a culture fit that you then end up with a bunch of people that look exactly like you, that all went to the same school. And I think for that, interview rubric and a very thorough, well thought out and a rigorous interview process that people are actually well trained on. So it can't be you just throw someone into a room and ask them to sword two strings. That cannot be what it is. And that's what we did at Delphix too, which is that we had a very rigorous, well thought out process. People had to be trained to be interviewed. And I think that is a big part of it.
Great, and I think one thing that has gotten some attention for this panel this evening too is around diversity and inclusion and the kind of the issues around that, especially in Silicon Valley. I mean, if you look in the audience right now, I mean, you can see that it's extremely weighted. And you know, what, if anything, have your companies done to make sure, one, is diversity and inclusion as part of anyone's culture, right? Is it an important piece of your hiring process? And what are some of the things that you have done? And I'm going to go through each one of you because I think it's an important question here. But what have you done and your company's done to make sure that you address diversity and inclusion issues in your hiring process and to include it as part of your culture?
For me, when I think about diversity and inclusion, diversity is a fit, but inclusion is how to make people work with each other once they fit. Inclusion is more important. We focus a lot on inclusion as well because for us it's important to empower people, ensure people actually are involved in the decision making. Sometimes it's hard to actually take into account meetings, for example. Are you really ensuring people who don't talk a lot are also having a voice in the discussion? Like, how can you make sure being fair when you promote people? How can you make sure when you're hiring someone, like there is panel decision and everyone feels included in the decision-making process. So I think if you take care of inclusion, naturally that the people's personalities will come up into hiring more diverse candidates. So I think first problem to tackle is inclusion and then diversity.
Similar answer, I guess. If you focus on inclusion and kind of what's the underlying aspect of that, which is fairness, because diversity, in a lot, today it means the default definition is gender, but certainly it means age and sexual orientation and ethnicity and probably other categories that we can't even think about. What you're trying to do is ultimately remove that bias from your entire process and your mindset. So we've done everything from training to blind screening. So we're evaluating more of the quality of the work before we actually learn more about the person. There's downsides to that, but these are different techniques. We've used Textio. It's a service that basically genericizes your job descriptions. It's really expensive. So you can trial and then subscribe and cancel. But anyway, just all these techniques that are none of these are silver bullets, but they all provide sort of as a counterbalance to whatever your biases might be. And ultimately, the best way I think you can't make yourself all knowing and all sympathetic, but you can certainly make sure that you've got a check and balance with your process and your people. So a lot of it is just kind of putting those checks and balances in place in every step and using every tool.
Yeah, all of this resonates quite a bit. All right. All of this resonates quite a bit. I don't have too much to add. I would say the main things is just like really firm rubrics and like good clarity of thought going into a new job description, a new role you're hiring for. I think there's like a lot of danger in sort of being a little bit lazy about how to set that up and exactly what you're looking for. And I think that's where bias or randomness or other bad things can sneak in. But when you're really crisp on what you're looking for from a cultural fit perspective, from a core skills perspective, and you really take the time to actually write out the rubric, and like no one starts interviewing if there's not a rubric that we all agree on and believe in. And I think that it takes time, it takes a lot of extra effort, but it's definitely worth it. So I think that's a really big piece of where we've been more successful, is just like putting in that time and energy.
I joke that I ensure diversity by being the hiring manager. So you'd be shocked as to kind of the range of responses I get from people when a woman is interviewing them, like both on the phone and in person. So it acts as a really good filter. I mean, I'm joking mostly. But I think one key thing there that I'm kind of alluding to is diverse hiring panels. As far as possible, I think I agree totally with what Tito said, which is a rubric for like the job descriptions. Obviously, you want the job descriptions to not have words like rock star, coder, or like, key things like don't. There's stats that have shown that women will only apply to jobs where they meet 100% of the requirements. So trying to be really, really clear about what you're actually looking for in a job description, stuff like that. Have diverse panels, but not at the cost of making like the only woman be in your company, like be on every single interview, but also like have people that are interviewing kind of be conscious or like look for signals for diversity in that, and then make your recruiters be aware that this is a goal for your company, like looking for more candidates, looking for I have like encouraged people to reach out to broader pools. And I found that often, like, people are more excited when they see like, oh, they get to work for a woman, and I'm like, okay, then you're the right kind of candidate that we are looking for.
And I think, what about a process, decks. I'm down 2 mics now. I'm like Magneto or something. So I think we spend a lot of time and a lot of energy on hiring, right? And part of this talks today were about retaining people, right? And how I think important it is to not only have your culture, you can talk about it, but actually have your company match the culture that you've talked about and how important that is. So from a cultural standpoint, how do you find that retaining employees, right? Because their match to the culture is so important, right? So what do you do to help retain them to really to keep that culture? Because every employee you add changes that culture somewhat, right? And there's a quote somewhere, and I think Nick said it before too, that process over time, right, becomes your culture. And it's something that has to be guarded, right, intended. Right? So do you have anyone at your companies that owns culture, or is it everybody's responsibility? And how do you kind of nurture that and make sure that it stays true to the course?
I think it's everyone's responsibility to own the culture. There are certain teams like HR who might actually encourage people and set up the culture to begin with, but it's everybody's responsibility to make sure that they carry it through. Some things that we do to retain is also we have made sure there is dual career path for people like who wants to grow in individual track as well as management track, because people in, I saw one of the questions there, I think people in IC track also want a leadership position, but not necessarily knowing how to do that. So we have different levels. We also have director level at the IC track, and then we also make sure that they get to work on some strategic initiatives. They get to drive it with product team, so they feel empowered in that decision-making process. And also going back to diversity question again, some of the things that we also made sure is we looked at our health benefits and said, does it actually cater to same-sex marriages, and like those kind of things too that you have to look at to make sure that employees feel happy across the board. So you have to look at different focus areas as well.
So I think it's a super important topic. I think like inclusion is the key thing, because it doesn't matter how many people you hire if you cannot keep them, you're constantly losing people. And I think people need to feel valued, that they're actually bringing something to the table. So essentially, like they need to kind of that kind of initial feeling that they had, that excitement when they joined the company. You need to kind of keep that alive. So essentially, it's really important that they be heard, that they feel that they have a growth path there. I think I'd go back to like, yes, it's very important to have separate tracks for ICs and managers. And I think all the companies that I've ever worked at have had that. And I think it's super important. So people want to be able to see where they will be like next week, next month, in a year, or so on and so forth. And they want to feel happy about where they work.
I think most of us here are engineering managers or engineering leaders, and a lot of times we're going to come into a company, that you're taking over a team, right? I mean, some of us they're starting up, and that's a greenfield thing, and that's pretty awesome in itself. But a lot of times in our careers, we're going to go into a company where maybe the culture has veered course, or the culture has become stagnant, or in some cases toxic, and you have to change the culture. And it's like changing a moving ship. So I know Seth has some experience in that. I want to just put the question over to him. And how do you deal with going into a company and affecting change on the culture as an engineering leader?
I think, so I would actually disagree with Nick a little bit in that process over time does become culture, it drives it, but I think also people over time I think when you join a company that's been around for a while, there are always those people that are already the go-to people, the known top people, engineers or otherwise, that effectively are your models of culture anyway. So the first thing I try to do is learn about what do they do well that makes them highly respected. Usually there's something there to build on. There's absolutely the model of the culture you want in the essence of whoever those go-to people, and identifying them, putting them in positions of influence. If you ever read Malcolm Gladwell, he has this book called Tipping Point. He likens the spread of information to the spread of viruses. You kind of need more points of infection, if you will, or maybe a different analogy is if you're the Pope, you need more priests. You need more people to spread the word. So the first thing is find those people, and they already are modeling that. And, you can both articulate what are the things that they specifically do that are influential and ideal to shape your culture, but also make sure they're in positions to then affect things, whether it's put them in a leadership position or formalize their awesomeness otherwise.
So we're going to have a couple of lightning sort of quick questions here as we sort of run out of time. And there's some awesome questions here that I wish we could spend another half an hour kind of going over. The first one is, how do you affect cultural change potentially without firing a lot of people, right? Is it possible? Yes, no? Can you affect change in culture without firing people? Yeah? How do you do it?
I mean, for one, it's a very broad question, right? I mean, it depends on what is it that you're looking at? Are you looking at a culture that is encouraging like actually illegal stuff? Then yes, then people need to be fired because you were doing something illegal. But if it's a thing of like mentality, or I think like Sushma pointed out about this, is like, were you like a smaller company where you had like smaller customers and now you're growing to a large company? Yes, it's absolutely possible. And I've seen multiple companies go through that change. It's essentially like deciding as a company, usually like driven by the leadership team, what are your priorities? And then making sure that everybody is aligned with those priorities. And I think that that's kind of essentially our job as leaders. Like at every level, you have to decide what are our new priorities and how do we kind of like align everybody to those. And you can absolutely do that without firing people.
There's so many awesome ones here. I'm going to answer one with a quick thing here. It says, one of the things, how can you design a leadership career track for engineers that don't want to go into management with direct reports? I'm going to ask everyone here to go Google search for Rent the Runway, Camille's engineering ladder, look at it, copy it. She put it up there for everyone to use, and it's a really good way to use as a baseline for people who want to develop dual-track engineering career paths, both for individual contributors and engineering leaders. Okay. It is, it's in the first half of her book. She's just Google search for Rent the Runway. She's the former CTO of Etsy, I believe. She has a book out called The Manager's Path, which I also highly recommend people to read. It's an awesome chapter-by-chapter guide into really being a good engineering leader, right? Yes. Quick, and then we gotta go.
The first chapter also teaches engineers how to be managed. So on day one, every single engineer gets a free copy of The Manager's Path, and they were required to read at least the first 2 to 3 chapters. So highly recommend checking out the book and giving it to your engineers.
I just want to say that this is a solved problem. It has been solved for a couple of decades. Look at all the larger companies. Like they've all solved this. Everybody has.
Not always successful. So. Yeah. All right. I wanted to wrap this up. Thank you, everyone in the panel. Now the microphone works. Thank you, everyone in the panel.